Right now, I mean, billions of dollars are just flowing into AI development with millisecond precision.
Hmm.
While at the exact same time, the copper wiring needed to actually power those massive compute clusters is, well, it's sitting on a cargo ship, just idling off the Horn of Africa because of, some opaque insurance dispute.
Right, yeah.
So, welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to look at the sources you've shared with us to really understand a massive emerging structural shift. We aren't just doing a standard news summary today.
No, definitely not.
We're moving past that, right? To unpack the hidden growing gap between our lightning-fast digital and financial systems and our incredibly slow-moving physical world.
And that contrast, that is really the defining feature of our current global architecture. To understand the world right now, observing what is breaking is actually less instructive than observing why the world appears so remarkably calm.
Yeah, because it does feel calm, right, on the surface.
Exactly. I mean, we have these massive, almost unprecedented underlying pressures building up in our energy grids, our global logistics, our physical infrastructure, and yet the surface remains incredibly placid.
It's weirdly quiet.
It is.
Yeah.
So we need to move away from these Hollywood collapse narratives and look at the actual mechanics of how our civilization is currently managing this tension.
Okay, let's unpack this, because right now, AI capital is acting as the absolute center of gravity for the global market.
Oh, absolutely.
All the money, all the attention is just getting sucked into this vortex of technological optimism. It feels like we are, seamlessly gliding into this highly automated, frictionless future.
Well, the financial markets certainly reflect that sentiment, right?
Right.
But the source has introduced this analytical framework called shear to explain the reality beneath that optimism.
Right. Sheer.
Yeah, shear. And it views the world as operating in distinct layers that are moving at fundamentally incompatible speeds. So at the very top, you have the OS layer, the operating system of the global economy. This encompasses AI computation, financial markets, high-frequency trading. That layer operates in milliseconds. It is running at a blinding, unprecedented velocity.
While the physical world operates in, years and decades?
Correct. So beneath the OS layer is the infrastructure layer. And this encompasses power generation, international shipping corridors, heavy resource extraction, government permitting, things like that.
Things that take a long time.
Exactly. Building a nuclear plant or negotiating a new deepwater port takes years, sometimes decades. And then beneath that, you have the membrane.
The membrane, the living membrane of daily life, right? The actual physical reality of regional water tables, local labor markets, municipal infrastructure. And that moves even slower.
Very slower, yeah.
So the friction this year you mentioned is the informational civilization drastically exceeding the adaptation speed of the physical civilization. I look at it like, okay, it's like taking a hyper-fast, state-of-the-art processor and just hot wiring it into a 10-year-old laptop.
That's a great analogy.
Right, because the processor, it wants to run at 1,000,000 miles an hour. It's pulling massive amounts of data, but, the old battery's draining in minutes.
Yeah, and the cooling fan is just screaming.
Exactly. It's screaming, trying to dissipate all that heat.
That captures the mechanical tension perfectly, actually. Wow. The processor's demanding resources. The underlying architecture simply wasn't designed to provide at that velocity.
But I struggle with this concept a bit when I look at the broader reality. I mean, if there is this much friction, if the processor is running that hot and starving the rest of the system, why aren't we seeing sparks flying everywhere?
That's the big question.
Why is the market not in a state of absolute panic? The fact that tech stocks are soaring makes it feel like the market is effectively subsidizing our physical reality. Is the financial optimism blinding us to the friction?
What's fascinating here is that the sheer size of the AI financial boom is literally overlaying our perception of reality.
Overriding it.
Yeah, it's acting as a psychological and financial shock absorber. The market is aggressively pricing in this frictionless, highly productive future. And that massive influx of capital buffers the immediate pain.
Oh, I see.
So when a tech giant needs massive amounts of power, their market cap is so large, they can just buy their way through the physical bottlenecks.
Yeah.
They just pay massive premiums to secure resources.
Wow. So the financial OS is writing enormous checks that the physical infrastructure is basically being forced to cash.
Precisely.
But let's look at the mechanics of those bottlenecks. The sources are very clear that AI has fundamentally transformed. It is no longer an quote-unquote information industry. It is a heavy physical extractive industry.
It is arguably the heaviest industry currently operating because it acts as a direct bridge between infinite digital computation, and highly finite physical resources. The bottleneck isn't a lack of software engineers anymore.
Right.
It is the physical architecture required to move and store data at that scale.
So let's talk about the hardware itself. The sources highlight high bandwidth memory, or HBM, as a critical choke point. And this isn't just about, printing more standard silicon wafers.
Not at all. Training foundational AI models requires moving astronomically large data sets simultaneously. Standard memory architecture physically cannot handle that throughput without melting.
Literally melting down.
Literally.
Yeah.
So HBM solves this by stacking memory chips vertically, microscopic layer by microscopic layer, to shorten the distance the data actually has to travel.
Okay.
But the precision required to manufacture these vertical stacks is staggering. And the heat generation is immense. The physical yield, meaning the number of usable chips you actually get from a production run, is severely constrained by the sheer complexity of the physics involved.
And that heat generation brings us to the next silent bottleneck, which is water and power. The sources point out that we aren't just using fans to cool these massive data centers anymore. We are talking about millions of gallons of water usage just to prevent the silicon from liquefying under the computational load.
It's massive. And cooling is only half the energy equation. The computation itself requires a staggering amount of electricity. This is where the structural friction becomes highly visible.
How so?
Well, tech companies often tout their investments in solar and wind, right? But data centers cannot operate on intermittent power. If a massive AI training run experiences even a millisecond drop in voltage because, say, the wind stopped blowing.
The whole thing crashes.
Exactly. The entire process can corrupt. You have to start over.
Which means they require baseload power. Continuous, uninterrupted, heavy power generation. And according to the sources, that is forcing a massive reliance on LNG, liquid natural gas.
Right. The digital OS demands perfectly consistent power, but the physical infrastructure layer has been trying to transition to intermittent renewables. The shear between those two realities forces a reversion to reliable, heavy hydrocarbons like LNG just to keep the processor running.
But extracting that LNG, manufacturing those complex HBM chips, and mining the sheer tonnage of copper required to wire these data centers together, all of that requires moving physical mass across the globe. You can't just run a copper wire directly from a mine in South America to a server rack in Virginia.
No, you definitely can't.
The moment that material hits a cargo ship, it enters our next friction point, which is geopolitical logistics.
And this is where we have to be incredibly analytical and avoid the temptation of apocalyptic thinking. We are currently seeing immense pressure on global shipping, particularly around the Strait of Hormuz and the broader Middle East. But the shipping hasn't stopped.
Right. There's no Hollywood-style global collapse. The shelves at the grocery store aren't completely empty.
Because the system hasn't broken. Instead, what the sources reveal is a quiet logistics war. It's not a blockade. It is a pervasive, compounding friction tax.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of that tax. Because of geopolitical tensions, major shipping conglomerates are physically rerouting vessels around the Horn of Africa to avoid the Red Sea. We are talking about adding thousands of miles to a journey.
Which fundamentally alters the math of global trade. Those extra miles require burning vastly more maritime bunker fuel.
Right.
It locks up vessel capacity for weeks longer than anticipated, meaning there are fewer ships available globally, which drives up freight rates everywhere. And simultaneously, the maritime insurance premiums for vessels that do brave the conflict zones have skyrocketed.
So the cost of everything just ticks up.
Everything. Every physical component the AI boom requires, from copper to cooling equipment, suddenly costs more and takes longer to arrive.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because these ships are primarily moving materials and manufactured goods between two dominant poles, the United States and China. And the sources offer a structural framework for this dynamic that, honestly, completely bypasses the usual political talking points about good versus evil. We're just looking at this impartially based on the text.
Right. If we apply the concept of incompatible operating systems to the US and China, the geopolitical friction makes total sense. The prevailing narrative is often about decoupling the idea that these two superpowers will simply separate into two distinct, isolated economies.
Right, you hear that everywhere.
But the structural reality outlined in the sources suggests that is virtually impossible.
I look at it like an organ transplant where the donor and the recipient have entirely different blood types, but they are both completely reliant on the exact same heart. They are biologically incompatible, but physically inseparable.
That's spot on. The incompatibility stems from the layers they dominate, The United States controls the financial OS and the AI capital OS. It dictates the fast-moving, high-level computational and market layers. China, conversely, dominates the manufacturing OS, the electrification OS, and the resource processing OS. They control the slow-moving, heavy physical layers that actually pull materials out of the earth and turn them into usable infrastructure.
So the US has the processor and the software, and China has the battery, the cooling fan, and the copper wiring. But why does that create such intense friction if they clearly need each other?
Because their capital cycles and time horizons are completely misaligned. The U.S. financial OS operates on quarterly earnings reports. It demands rapid, frictionless scaling and immediate returns on investment.
Right, millisecond trading.
Exactly. But the Chinese manufacturing OS operates on decade-long infrastructure timelines. It requires massive, state-backed sunk costs and long-term resource planning. You have a millisecond-driven financial engine trying to interface with a heavy industry machine that measures progress in decades.
Wow, they are completely out of sync. But as you noted, they can't simply unplug from one another. You can't run the AI software without the physical hardware, and you can't monetize the physical hardware without the AI in the financial market.
This creates a state of high-friction codependence. Neither side can fully cut the other off without triggering a systemic collapse of their own operating system. But functioning together generates immense structural heat.
So that heat manifests as what?
Well, every tariff, every export control on semiconductors, every restriction on critical minerals, it's all a manifestation of these two incompatible systems grinding against each other.
And just to impartially report on the sources here, I want to emphasize this isn't about endorsing one system over the other. It is purely an observation of mechanical reality. If the two main gears of the global economy are grinding, the spaces acting as the lubricant between them suddenly become incredibly valuable.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this high-friction codependence is fundamentally rewriting the geopolitical map. Intermediate regions, places like the ASEAN nations, India, the Middle East, they are seeing their influence skyrocket.
Because they're in the middle.
Exactly. They are acting as the physical routers between the two incompatible operating systems.
They launder the friction.
Precisely. They facilitate the energy transport, they handle the intermediate manufacturing, and manage the trade flows that allow the U.S. financial OS and the Chinese manufacturing OS to interact without direct explosive contact.
That makes total sense.
The structural fatigue of the superpowers is essentially the growth engine for the intermediaries.
So what does this all mean for you, the person listening right now? We've explored the massive capital influx into AI, the mechanics of high bandwidth memory, the routing of cargo ships, the structural misalignment of superpower capital cycles. How does the shear between the OS layer and the physical layer actually exert pressure on the membrane of daily life?
The defining characteristic of this era is that the disruption doesn't look like a disaster movie.
Right.
We are psychologically conditioned to wait for the sudden market crash or the total grid failure. But the data points to a different mechanism entirely. The sources call it chronic depolarization.
We keep waiting for the X-ray to show a clean break in the bone. But what we actually have is a degenerative joint disease. The system isn't snapping, it is experiencing chronic compounding fatigue.
The physical world is slowly exhausting itself, trying to accommodate the velocity of the digital world. And that tension transfers downward. The OS layer doesn't absorb the friction, it pushes it down into the membrane.
And you feel that downward pressure in highly mundane ways. I mean, you aren't going to wake up and find the global economy has vanished. You're going to wake up and notice that your base utility rate has quietly increased by another 8%.
Exactly.
Why? Because your local power grid had to buy massively upgraded, highly expensive transformers just to balance the load from the new AI data center in the next county over.
And you'll see at the grocery store, the cost of a box of cereal goes up. Not because of a sudden food shortage, but because the compounding costs of maritime insurance, rerouted shipping, and higher bunker fuel eventually trickle down the supply chain.
They just get baked into the retail price.
Right. They have to pass that cost on somewhere.
You'll notice that the free shipping threshold for your online shopping just jumped from $30 to $50. You'll see local municipal construction projects like, I don't know, a new bridge or a school delayed or over budget, because the raw copper and steel required for those projects are being diverted at massive premiums to build global computing infrastructure.
This raises an important question about structural resilience. Massive tech conglomerates and financial institutions have the capital to absorb these friction taxes. But small regional logistics companies, local transport businesses, and everyday consumers, they do not.
They really don't.
The physical world, the world where you buy your groceries, pay your electric bill, and drive your car, is being systematically forced to absorb the costs of the digital world's relentless acceleration.
It's the normalization of a constantly slightly painful state. We are caught in a profound phase difference. The financial markets are eagerly eating into the future, pricing in decades of AI-driven productivity and boundless wealth.
Yeah.
But our physical infrastructure, our supply chains, our local institutions, they operate in the real world of dirt, steel, water, and time. They just cannot metabolize that speed.
AI may be accelerating the future, but the physical world may not be accelerating at the same speed.
And that leaves us with one final lingering question to ponder on your own. We know that the sheer scale of the AI financial boom, this massive wave of market optimism, is currently acting as a shock absorber. It is the only thing masking our awareness of this severe physical friction.
Right.
So what happens to our perception of everyday life the moment the market decides to take a breath, the capital influx slows down, and that shock absorber finally runs out of travel?